Today I was actually thinking a lot about productivity because it's like performance review season at work, which is like kind of like a stressful but also like very interesting topic.
And how many of these have you been through, like, so far?
I guess
What's the reviews?
I don't know, like 2 or 3. But like the process changes every time. And it's really interesting because I had this conversation with my coworker about like how do you like just like how the past year has been for both of us, which was a really interesting thing because it wasn't like you're reviewing me or like I'm reviewing you. We were like, how have things been going? And like what was working. And it's weird, right? Because you can only do like a finite amount of things. So I was reading this article by the author of SendMail the other day, and he was like, "Well, one cool thing about SendMail it was mostly written by me, so we had a lot of like constraints around the fact that it was just me, and so we couldn't add like unnecessary features, right?"
Yep. And this is like a common story for open source software or things, craft-like things that were done by one person, right? That they can't have feature bloat. In the beginning, at least, until it becomes successful, and then it has a bunch of feature bloat.
Yeah. I think this is like true of a lot of projects. Like you'll have something which is started by like a really small group, and then it proceeds like pretty efficiently for a while. And then later on, you add a bunch of people to it, and then everything gets like complicated and difficult. And it's weird, right? Because you just want to like maintain this like small group, like one person feeling forever, or like two-person feeling forever.
Yeah. So, what do you think is a pressure for growth? Right? I mean, this happens in every level, right? In organizations, in hobby projects, in art, in movies, and everything. So, this is a general. So, what do you think propels that growth, even though everybody knows that a small focus team is the best? For one of those.
I don't know. I mean, I guess eventually you actually legitimately have to start doing more stuff. Like with SendMail, for example, right? Like if it needs to run on like a million different computers, then there are a lot more edge cases. So it's not really reasonable to have a single developer, right? So then you need to like, I guess in the case of SendMail, like have like a big open source community around it, who need to work together, and like you have to have like code review, and then you have to have all this process. But in that case, you definitely, like in open source, you definitely have to, right? Because one person can build a huge open source project like the Linux kernel, because there's like 8 million lines of code in the Linux kernel. Like I was talking to someone the other day was saying like, you can just think about this in terms of lines of code. Like if a project has 8 million lines of code, it definitely wasn't written by a single person, right? Even though we always say that that's not what developer productivity is.
Yeah, and I think that the thing to think about with religious software in particular, since we're familiar with it, is that there's the kind of role of the project leads is kind of setting the vision and style and kind of module system and architecture, for lack of a better term. And then in Linux, for example, there's 8 million lines of code, but a ton of it is drivers, right? It's like API for drivers, and then everybody just writes a driver for their particular hardware that fills up 4 million of those lines. And there's that compact core. I mean, same thing with like Python, right? Most of the code is libraries, and then there's that compact core of what is the language, and that gets argued back and forth. And you really want to be conservative about revving the language itself because you don't want to break compatibility and stuff. So I guess that's one way to keep some kind of conceptual elegance while your project grows, but it's hard.
Yeah. And maybe that's a good way to think about it, that like you have like your core and like your core interface, which you need to like have a lot of arguments and committees around. Like the way that like when you're defining new web standards, you have like a bajillion committee meetings. But then like if you can get that right, then you can isolate things off in a really nice way and everyone can just like do their own thing.
Yeah, like drivers are a great example, right?
Yeah,
in Linux,
yeah, like drivers.
Everyone is fairly self-contained, but of course because it's a monolithic kernel, the issue is if you have some crazy driver bug, it could crash and make the whole system unstable, right? That you're installing something and there's like 50 different drivers written by people in different companies and stuff, and if one of them breaks, someone's computer just seems like it's being destroyed, and it's not the fault of the core developers. And so yeah, it's not easy. But I guess bringing it back to how it relates to you personally and personal productivity, let's bring that back beyond, unless you're planning to be the next Linux. How are you thinking about it, like zooming in for yourself?
Yeah, so I just moved to a different team, which has been really interesting because I moved to a team which was like until very recently like 3 people, which had kind of the same thing of like, okay, we're responsible for this like small area, and we can't do an unlimited number of things because there's only 3 of us. And I guess like there, like organizationally, it's about like defining the interfaces. I'm saying like, okay, we're a team responsible for like this like set of things, which is super difficult because like there are actually no like natural boundaries for like a team at a company.
So I guess we're talking about the level of 3 to 5 people rather than 1 person at this point. So what do you think about, in a bigger organization, there's always going to be pressure from outside to be like, you all have to do more because we need more done. And how do you push back against that and say, we need to do what we do well and not features creep too much as a team? Like, what are your thoughts about that?
Well, I also feel like you can literally do more if you're less people in a way.
How so? That's interesting.
Well, like, because if you work with like a lot, like, I don't know, it's like this like mythical man month thing, right? Which is a book I haven't read.
You're recreating the book. You're basically recreating the mythical man month in these 20 minutes. So
it's like, this is what I think that the book says, but
yeah,
like, because you have all these like extra coordination costs, which are important and like worth it. In like, it's like you're not like communicating with people for no reason, right? But I was thinking, so like if you have bad boundaries around your team, like let's say you have a service with a bad interface or like which doesn't, and then people like never know if they're supposed to fix the problem or if you're supposed to fix the problem, like then you can end up with like a lot of back and forth communication about like what like your software is doing and how it should do that.
You mean the boundaries between your team and someone else or within your team?
Yeah, like between your team and someone else.
Mm-hmm. So like the scope of what you're responsible for versus what someone else is responsible. And a lot of stuff might fall in the middle, right? So then you have to, if you're not explicit about that, then things get dropped or people get mad.
Yeah, exactly. And then like it can take a lot of, like, so for example, if there's code that like you should be developing inside your own team, but then other people end up developing outside, then like it's like they're spending too much time like learning about your internals, and then they spend like a week working on like making some small change that you could have probably done yourself inside your team in a day.
Yeah, and how would you avoid these inefficiencies? Because this comes up in a lot of things, right? That if everyone were omniscient, we would know, okay, this is not the best use of these people's time because they don't know this interface well, and we do. But we're not all omniscient. So how could how did people stay aware of this as the organization grows, of what people are working on or what people are going to be best suited for and such?
I don't know. I mean, I'm not actually good at this stuff. I just think about it because like I know that I'm bad at it, right?
Well, it's important too. It's something that every organization faces, not just software. Anybody who wants to get anything done has to deal with this.
Yeah. Like we're working on like a deployment system, which is kind of a good interface because like the people deploying the code should definitely not have to fix the deployment system to do that, right? Like the deployment system should definitely just work. But then like if you need to like reconfigure the deployment system to like learn about a new service, then like is that the job of the maintainers or is that the job of the people deploying the code, right? Like,
and do you feel like it's kind of a manager type person's job to be in charge of that, or is it the engineers who should be in charge of kind of defining these boundaries and walls and saying no, I guess, and pushing back? I mean, who do you think should participate in this process or lead that process within a group?
I don't know. Like, I think I'm realizing that people who are good at this stuff are like really much better at it than people who are bad at this stuff. Because like, I think it's easy to be like, oh, this is like some organizational problem. Okay, I'm in an organization. I can figure it out. Which is like, it's good to be like empowered to like feel like you can fix your own organization. But then sometimes when I talk to people who like are really good at organizations, I'm like, oh, you actually know what you're doing. Like, and so like maybe it should be partly managers' jobs because they're like supposed to be good at knowing about organizations.
Yeah, it's I think part of this, I mean, this whole thing we're talking about, Mythical Man Month and coordination costs, is that we're not all one Borg hive mind, right? That it's like when things are in your head, things the neurons connect really fast, and you know what things are. As long as you're relatively organized, stuff happens in your head. As soon as you get a second person or a third person or a different group with different goals and different trajectories, it just gets super complicated. And, you know, people have been trying to think for years about how to do intra-office communication and coordination.
Yeah.
There's no like magic formula for it. I mean, people aren't going to write detailed documentation, or, you know, a lot of people don't like meetings for certain things. And yeah, I don't know. I can't claim to have any good insights about this either.
Yeah. But I feel like for me, like the most exciting thing would be like to be on a team of like not a lot of people, which also has like a lot expected of it in a way, but like a lot of expected of it in like a focused way, right? Because if you're working on like the same thing, and you're trying to do that thing really well, then I think you can make like a lot of progress in a short amount of time. But if you're working on like 7 things, then like you can't actually make progress on those 7 things.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's everyone's dream to work on a small, focused team of really good people who you also end up getting along with, and, you know, things just roll really well. I mean, even so, and from a university perspective, we have much smaller areas. I mean, I have graduate students I work with, or undergrads or stuff, and a lot of times, like, just 2 of us can do a lot, right, back and forth, because we don't need more people. If we're building a small prototype or running a study, you know, given the right timing and the right people and the right vibe, you can just get a ton done, right? And like adding, if you just have not the right people, just adding 5 more people isn't going to help at all. It's going to make it worse. Everybody wants to get in that flow situation of not just personally, but with 1 or 2 or a small set of people working toward a common goal. You know, what do you think happens when, you know, that ideal isn't met, right? So like you're in a company or an organization, and, you know, not everyone is going to be, you know, on board with the right caliber or the right personality or the right disposition. So, you know, how do you think people keep moving forward well, given that, you know, not everyone is fitting in perfectly, I guess?
I feel like mobility is kind of good. Like, I was talking to someone about how you sometimes do this like social matching thing, where like you like work with people a little bit and you kind of like feel out how it is to work with them, and you're like, oh, I work like really well with this person, and then you try to like propel yourselves towards like projects that they're working on. And if you're not allowed to like move around inside the organization, then that's not good.
And I guess the flip side of that we could discuss is, you know, this, you know, one flip side of mobility, and you're talking about rapport and getting along with the teammates, is that it might lead to homogenous teams, right? It's like everybody loves doing X here, we love kernel hacking, whatever, and you just talk about that nonstop, and then we don't get perspectives from designers or from business people or UX people, so that people might, you know, given perfect freedom, people will self-segregate and clump into their own clumps, however that's defined. So how do you feel that plays out?
That's a great question. Yeah. I mean, I guess this is the thing where like being friends with someone is not the same as working well with them. But it is actually important to work well with people who you're working with. And I still don't know exactly like what it means, like how to know if you're gonna work well with someone, right? Or like, yeah,
Yeah, man, these are puzzlers. I don't claim to have any answers to this, but it is you know, when I think about these issues of, you know, what happens when you swing things one way to the extreme, right, versus other. I mean, the other extreme is, you know, we do some top-down command and control thing. We're like, oh, we really want to maximize diversity in our teams, and we'll put these people who are really different together, so hopefully things that good will come out. And in the ideal case, people do discover each other's different strengths and stuff, and things work out. But in the non-ideal case, people are resentful that they're being assigned stuff and things. But
so maybe like one example of a real working styles difference is some people like to like take a thing and then go off on their own and like solve the problem and then like come back like a week later, right? And I think that can actually work really well, like in some cases. And some people really like to like collaborate and like talk all the time. And I think if you put someone who like loves to like talk all the time with someone who wants to like go off in a corner, it like doesn't work that well sometimes.
Well, that's what, like, I mean, there's this big criticism of open plan offices in that, you know, if you like to talk through your work or do pair programming, it's really nice to have a more open plan. But like, if you're the person who really wants to just hunker down for a while, then you just get super annoyed because you have to put your headphones on and everybody around you is, you know, shuffling.
Yeah. Yeah. And I think it's good to like respect those kinds of differences. And not be like, you have to be like this.
Yeah, it's hard. I mean, this is a hard thing. I mean, do you have thoughts about just kind of, we're zooming out to the, 3 to 5 person level. What about the n=1 level of, I guess you start to think about the productivity thing about yourself and
Yeah.
thoughts about that.
Trying to get better at doing one thing at a time.
Okay.
I think if you do one thing at a time, it's really good.
Yep. And
Um,
what challenges do you have with that? I mean, do you feel yourself doing multiple things? And what's the granularity of switching? Like once an hour, once a day, once a week? Like, because you're saying you're
yeah.
trying to do multiple things.
Like I think like all of the like I was looking at someone's pull requests and I was like, oh, they made like 7 pull requests on the same service, right? Which totally makes sense that you would do and that would be better. Um, like I'm sometimes like shocked at how much I can do in like 3 hours if I actually pay attention. Like I'm like, oh, that thing is really hard, and then I'll like be like, well, what if I spent the afternoon on it? And I'm like, oh, it wasn't that hard. It was just an afternoon of hard, right? Like,
And what prevents you from doing that more, knowing that that's a good thing for you?
I don't know. Like, what's hard about that? I think being interrupted happens a lot. Like sometimes like something will come up or like I'll get an email that I've been waiting for and I'm like, oh no, I have to reply to this email that I've been waiting for. I know that you think about this a lot and like how to like organize your days because you write a lot about it.
Yeah, I mean, it's the age-old story of if you have a few hours of focus time, it's really good, but interruptions will come in. And I think, there are people that are super disciplined about like, in the morning, I'm going to work for 3 hours and not check my email until, one ideal is I'm going to get up early in the morning, work for 2 or 3 hours, don't check my email or do any errands, just work. And then afterwards, check my email and do everything. And I've not been able to be disciplined about doing that. So people I know have, but I haven't. And I guess the way I think about it is I want to do one primary thing a day, and then everything else is kind of secondary, and not secondary as in they're not important, but they're like not needing my full attention. And I think, being in academia, I have more of the luxury of doing that because I don't have to like fight fires in production systems, right? It's like if you're working on production code, like you can't just be like, oh, I'm going to do this because like something else really demands your attention. So
Yeah.
for me, for example, like this is super boring, but like today, my main goal was to like, I just moved to UC San Diego. I don't know if you, I know I moved to California, so, but now you do. So I'm at UCSD now. So I have to like start up here and like do all the setup with everything of my lab. So I have to like, as part of that, we have to do human subjects training and like fill out IRB and human subjects forms for my research project. And like, I have to like do that. So today I was like, all right, I'm going to figure out how to do that and just do that. And I managed to do that for the beginning part of the day. And then the rest of the day, I'll just get little small errands done. So I think for me, I'm okay checking my email and being interrupted as long as I have a goal. Beginning of the day, it's like my primary thing today is X. I want to just at least get X done. And then everything else is like a nice bonus. Like it doesn't mean I don't do anything else. It just means other stuff are secondary, smaller things. And
Yeah.
to the extent possible you can do that, that's great. But I understand if there are other dependencies, and people maybe
Yeah.
harder to block that off.
I guess today my big thing that I wanted to do is I had this like really large scary change that I wanted to deploy. And so I went and I had my deploy plan and I went and tried to deploy it and like I tested it out on a small amount of traffic and then something like unexpected went wrong. And so I rolled it back and then like I wrote up an email, like a support email being like, why did this unexpected thing happen?
Yeah, that's
then,
still one thing, right? That's still complete,
yeah.
right? I mean, obviously a lot of things. Yeah, a good example is yesterday. I think I was trying to work on some refactoring some code or something, and then I did it, and I think it was successful in the sense of I got to the end and I realized that I need to like take another approach and roll it back, right? And it's like, that sucked, but I had to have done it because if I didn't do it, I wouldn't have realized that I needed to do something else. Like,
Yeah.
So it's like sometimes you don't get to a satisfying ending, but at least like you tried that block. Now I think going back to like the 3-hour thing you said earlier, I feel like, yeah, you can just get like a 2 or 3 hour block of substance every day where you're like, all right, I did something concrete and like substantive, and you do that every single day. Like that just adds up. I mean, that's the best any of us can do, right?
Yeah. Yeah. I've started doing at the for Career Center, there's this like alumni check-ins thing where people will post like basically daily check-ins about what they're doing. And I find it really good to see like what other people's like 2-hour tasks were that day. You know?
So tell me a bit about that. Yeah, I mean, and give some context just for people who don't know.
Oh yeah. So the Career Center is this this program is basically a community where people like will sometimes do a 12-week retreat to become a better programmer. So I did it like 3 years ago. But then there's this like ongoing community aspect of it. And when you're doing the 12-week program, you will do like a daily check-in to be like, hey, I mean, everyone knows who you are, but you're like, hey, this is what I'm working on today. And then like you kind of always talk to the same people, so then they get a sense for what you're doing and they can talk to you about it. And then when you graduate, then you don't have that anymore. So some people started doing check-ins every day, like remotely.
And so what is the form of that? Is that a text, like a chat message?
So it's basically like maybe like it's like a 200-word post, basically. Often, or sometimes just like one line.
Yeah, no, I really like this idea. And do you feel like because most of the people I presume have gone on and are working at companies or stuff, do you feel like there's a barrier to people posting about that because they're working on like company stuff, or are people good enough about just generalizing? Oh, I try to refactor something like. Because people are working at different companies and organizations, how do you feel the social vibe is to doing check-ins remotely?
I feel like it's okay. I mean, like normally you need to like anonymize what you're doing a little bit. So for example, I've been talking to a vendor a lot. So I'll be like, oh, I was talking to this vendor and I've never really like had to communicate with the vendor before, like a software vendor about like stuff. So I'm trying to figure out like how to get it done, right? And how to be efficient about it. And other people will be like, oh, I have also talked to vendors, right?
And do people actually communicate? I mean, do people actually kind of give advice in this, or is it just more of like a forcing function for you to check in yourself and to kind of feel the other people around you are checking in?
Yeah. So sometimes people will like will like respond, and sometimes someone will just say like what they did, and then there's no response. And I think either way, it's fine.
Yeah. When I was at Google, they had this weekly snippets thing, like. It was just some like little thing where like at the end of the week, you get some email prompt and then you like click on a link and you just fill in like what you did this week and what you want to do next week or something very lightweight. And the purpose of that was all just private. I think it was share with your manager too, whatever. But I think the purpose of that is actually just to keep a record so that when like the performance reviews, like you're talking about, when we have performance reviews, you can actually write up what did I do this quarter, and you can just look at every week's thing. And if you've been doing a good job tracking, you should be able to write up a higher level synthesis of your goals and your accomplishments and stuff. And that helps you when you get reviewed every cycle and such. So yeah. I think it is valuable. This kind of lightweight logging is valuable, even if it's for yourself. So that's another aspect of it.
Yeah. It turns out that I like doing it a lot more with people who I don't work with, because it's a lot more interesting to hear what other people are working with, because it's always like totally different.
Interesting. So that's why you like that distributed community aspect.
Yeah, and I also started doing it in like a different community. I mean, I don't know, I'm like really into it right now.
And it's when do you do this? At the end of the day or the beginning of the day, or
kind of at random, and not necessarily every day, but
I see. And how do you make a habit of this that you consistently do it?
I'm extremely bad at habits. I expect to like eventually fall off.
Yeah, I mean, like a daily email ping could be one way, right? I'm just like, reply to this email with your thoughts, and then it just goes on and just posts somewhere. Yeah, I find that like email pings work well. Yeah, and this kind of self-reflection sort of thing, as long as it's pretty lightweight and it doesn't feel like anyone is forcing you to do it. What I've done actually is, so what I've been doing since I started back in academia 3 years ago. So I got my PhD in 2012, and then I worked at Google as an engineer for a year, and then I went back on the academic kind of research and teaching route. And what I did for 3 years, actually, it's been exactly 3 years, is been keeping like a log of kind of a work log, but not in the traditional sense, right? Not in the sense of what did I do today? Like I, wrote an abstract for this paper, or I looked up related work, or I met with so-and-so about blah, blah, blah. So I found that I actually in grad school for a whole year, I tried logging once, and it was cool because I got a lot of stuff for blog posts, but it was a bit too much. So what instead I've been doing is writing down kind of inner feelings and thoughts and reflections about my work for the day or the whatever, like stuff that you can't normally see in an artifact, right? So if I like, for example, if I could write down like, if I were to write down, oh, I did X, I did Y, I did Z, that will eventually come out in like a presentation or a paper or whatever. So like that stuff I don't really need to write down that much. But what doesn't come out in the paper or the research output is my feelings and my metacognition and my reflection. So what I have is I just have a text file that literally, whenever I feel like writing, again, it's not a daily enforced schedule, whenever I feel like writing some insights about work, or I don't do this for life like outside of work, I do this strictly for professional interactions, I would just write it down. I would just put a date and I would just like write whatever I want and then stop. And then so sometimes I go days without filling out, sometimes I fill it out every day. There's no habit or anything, and I have 3 years worth of these logs now, and it's fun sometimes to go back in time to look at old logs, because you kind of see how you had seed the similar ideas or thoughts again and again. And one of the biggest surprises for me doing this is how often I repeated thinking the same idea again and again until I actually like did it. So this podcast thing came out of an idea that I had, a year ago, and I just kind of thought about it in various terms until I was like, all right, now is the time to do it. So whenever you have thoughts about this,
I like the idea of talking about your perspective on a thing. Like, I think about design documents sometimes. And the point of a design document is actually to like articulate what your perspective, or I mean, there are many points, but one reason is to articulate what your perspective was on the system before you wrote it, right? And then you can go back and you can be like, what were our assumptions? And you can be like, oh, our assumptions were very different from the reality that like actually happened. And so it's less about like what you did, which, as you say, you can see, right? You can be like, well, we built the system, but you can't always tell like why you built that system, or what assumptions led you to build that system.
Yeah, so it's like design docs are a even higher level of comments, right? So it's like, we're taught that good code comments are not just describing what's in the code. It's kind of describing our thought processes or weird hacks. And then a good design document is beyond just here's the API for our code, right? It's like it's beyond that. It's reflecting and justifying and designing, and that's something that's hard to capture. You can't see it by the code or the version history of the code, right? So I guess the generalization I said before is if you had a perfect version history of your code or your writings or your drafts, you could see the process at work, but you still can't see the thoughts behind it, and that's what I want to capture in just a lightweight way. Cool. So we're running a bit short on time. So final parting thoughts. So I guess, I guess I want you to brainstorm a bit about, advice you would possibly give to, to your past self about this personal or small team productivity thing that, you think would be useful if you had to orient a new person on your team to get them up to speed to be Julia style productive. What thoughts would you have?
If we're talking about teams, I find it's really useful to like think about what's good about the people who I work with, because like the people who I work with have like really different strengths. So for example, I work with someone who's like extremely good at giving like very detailed code review and like finding edge cases that I wouldn't have noticed. So he'll be like, what if this happens? And I'm like, I didn't think of that. What if that happens? Oh my God, right? Like, and like, I've started to think of that more as like, more of like instead of like telling everyone else they should be like that, right? You should just like recognize what people are good at. But it's actually really useful in your day-to-day work, right? To recognize what like individual people are good at. Instead of trying to focus on like what they're not good at.
Yeah, I mean, this is a really good point of if you can bring that out in people, then they feel more productive and more valued as well, right? And they feel that their contributions are more valued, and there's this upward cycle. So maybe that's the key nugget there.
Yeah, and it just makes it easier too, like to like work with people, because if you're like this person never writes anything down, you can be like, well, maybe that's just the person who never writes anything down, right? And like,
yeah, and like the code review thing would be the edge case thing is a great example, right? So it's like the negative way to view that is, oh, why is this person always criticizing what we're producing? You know, we're trying to write new code and produce, and this person's always criticizing. But the way to frame it you have is this is actually really good for testing our assumptions and and making sure it's more robust.
And I mean, like, it's a totally critical skill, right? Because you're doing, like, if you're operating like at scale, then like,
yeah,
it's all edge cases all the time.
Will go wrong, right? Even the most unlikely thing will go wrong sometime.
Yeah, like probably like 100 times, like in the first like 2 hours or something. So.
All right, thank you so much, Julie. Well, thanks so much for your thoughts. We'll